Hello, and welcome to the Compact podcast. Today we'll be discussing the media's response to the recent serious assassination attempt on the life of the Slovakian President Robert Fico. Authorities in the country have charged but not named a man in the case, describing him only as a politically motivated lone wolf. We'll be trying to analyse where Fico fits politically. We'll also be looking ahead to Biden and Trump debates currently scheduled for June and September. What will the two veteran politicians say to one another? And finally, we'll give our opinion on the official coronation portrait of my king, Charles III, by artist Jonathan Yeo. I'm your host, Nina Power, and I'm joined today by Sohrab Ahmari, Matthew Schmitz, and Geoff Shullenberger. So last October, we published a piece in Compact on Slovakia by Peter Drulak, a former deputy foreign minister of the Czech Republic and ambassador to France, which described Fico's outlook as, quote, pragmatic, social democratic politics focused on the concerns of voters rather than those of progressive activists. The BBC and other mainstream media companies describe Fico instead as divisive. But what do we make of him?
Well, it's striking to me just reading the coverage because I was not particularly familiar with Slovakian politics until we edited and published this piece by Drulak last year. But, he situated it in a broader tendency that you find in some parts of Europe where there's a kind of commitment to the principles of social democracy. Now, in the case of Fico, he was a member of the Communist Party prior to the end of communism in Czechoslovakia. And one thing that would differentiate him from some sort of more socially conservative social democrats in Western Europe is that his party has also been accused of nostalgia for communism, of nostalgia for the pre-1989 order. And, this seems to have some truth to it, right? There have been sort of photo ops with, at the grave of Czechoslovakia's last communist president. There have been, other kinds of attempts to invoke parts of that legacy. But on the other hand, that simply reflects the fact that many voters in this country do actually have things that they genuinely miss from that era and probably have good reason to, such as steady jobs, access to healthcare, housing, and various other social goods that were provided. People who are interested might check out Helen Andrews's piece on what Soviet nostalgia gets right, which covers the case of East Germany, where interestingly, likewise, you have this kind of certain element of nostalgia for the communist past, which can also be connected to forms of what are usually considered right-wing politics in the case of the rising party Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, which is the most controversial party for its stances on various things that are also controversial in the party in Fico's platform, including a skepticism about mass immigration, a certain amount of Euroscepticism, skepticism towards the EU, and a desire to find a resolution to the Ukraine war because the sanctions imposed on Russia are having disastrous fallout for average people across Europe. And so, he's a figure who reflects the specific sort of ideological and political coordinates and history of his region. He's a member of one of the major parties, which is a center left or sort of social democratic party. Yeah, good point. So the media coverage has pointed to a certain degree of alliance between a figure like Viktor Orban in Hungary and Fico in Slovakia, and that does not necessarily mean that Fico is a conservative as Orban is, so much as that they do see eye to eye on certain things, including a certain skepticism towards the way the EU is being run, a skepticism towards mass migration, and a more conciliatory approach to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which I don't think we need to see as necessarily right-coded positions. And in fact, historically, there have been many figures across Europe on the left who have been skeptical of the European Union. This is a very long history. In fact, much of the European left was quite skeptical of it. It was seen as very clearly a sort of neoliberal representation of commercial and business interests. And so, I think that the thing that I will comment on, not knowing the Slovakian case that deeply, is just that it's impossible for this figure to be covered as anything other than a right winger, even though he's both symbolically often aligned himself with the communist past in Eastern Europe, and at the same time is part of a party that is explicitly social democratic, and thus on the left end of the political spectrum in orientation, but simply by taking positions skeptical of the EU, skeptical of the refusal to find any negotiated path to peace in Ukraine, you are automatically flagged as being on the right, which I think is and as being a right wing extremist, even, which I think is just further evidence of the kind of moral and political blackmail that is used to attempt to enforce these positions, which are increasingly unpopular with large numbers of citizens, regardless of their political outlook in Europe, for the simple reason that it's actually worsening. Many of these things are directly and immediately worsening their quality of life. So it's been interesting just to have covered it, through a journalist who's written for us, who is a local and understands the politics there, and laid it out in our pages in very clear terms. And then to see the international coverage attempting to catch up with the situation and just very crudely framing it and kind of adopting these propagandistic terms that are really used by essentially EU sort of bureaucrats and oligarchs to attempt to rule any dissent on these various issues out of any polite discussion. So I do recommend people go back to that piece, because it is written by somebody who's who's from the region, who's involved in the politics of the region, and deeply familiar with the history. And so, I've been struck by how strange and crude the coverage of this incident has been so far.
Yeah, I'll just vein very briefly, because there's not much to say until we find out what really happened and what motivated this assassination attempt. We should call it that. Is just to point out something that Nina did in her opening, which is that there is a divide that's very significant for us at Compact, between people who call themselves social democrat, and that the dividing line is whether or not you're fully bought into like the US led liberal order, including all its kind of ideological elements, which have to do with what you think about issues like gender, immigration, etc., or whether your social democratic affiliation and commitment is really just about making sure that the political economies work for ordinary people. And if it means the first thing that I mentioned, then Fico is not a social democrat, I guess, by that definition. But if being a social democrat is about being for ordinary people, for maintaining the stability of their livelihoods, for protecting them from the ravages of the market, etc., then he emphatically is a social democrat. And I think that the piece that we ran by him, by Pat Strulak, a former deputy foreign minister of the Czech Republic, is worth noting, is the correct account of his politics. And this tendency to frame him, and I've seen it in the New York Times as well and elsewhere, be like, the divisive prime minister of Slovakia is just this kind of vile, sort of low blow tendency to say that unless you agree with full spectrum progressivism in all its ramifications, which include both, maximalism on gender questions and maximalism on Ukraine, then you are a right winger, a Putinist. That's what's happening to Fico, and it's unacceptable. It's the same thing as Compact's contributing editor Glenn Greenwald has been repeatedly described in the Washington Post as a far right figure or a right wing figure. And anyone who knows Glenn knows that he's a civil libertarian on domestic issues. He's a opponent of American foreign policy hawkism in the same way that any number of progressives and leftists of, who were born before 1979 would be. So I think that's our value added here as Compact, is just to say, like, social democracy is not about whether or not you support 100% hawkism on Ukraine, but rather about whether you um, want ordinary people to be protected from the ravages of the market, period. And so, especially at this moment, it's so repulsive that to see um, some of these kind of mainstream center left outlets, after the guy's been shot and almost killed, describe him as divisive, the controversial prime minister. It's like, was he has a certain set of policies, and you don't like some aspects of that policy mix. Like, if any politician is, what is one politician who is not in some way divisive or controversial? Can anyone on this podcast think of a politician who's not divisive or controversial in one point or another? Like, what does that even mean? It's such a repulsive thing they do. Anyway,
in recent years, there's been a lot of talk about career assassination or cancellation, and I think as overwhelming and punitive as those things can be, they're certainly to be preferred to the actual phenomenon of assassination, which, though I don't have any data to back this up, seems to me to have declined in recent decades as a tool of politics. We've certainly seen assassination reemerge in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict with the attack on Alexander Dugin that resulted in the death of his daughter, Darya Dugin, covered in our pages by Michael Millerman. That attack was, if not celebrated, at least defended by quite a few people in the West. We have no idea what's behind the attack on Fico, but if we see a re-legitimation of assassination as a tool of political conflict, or even its popularization as something that's resorted to by isolated wackos, that'll prove to be even worse than the softer forms of assassination that we've operated under more recently.
Yeah, I think let's hope we're not looking at a Franz Ferdinand World War One scenario. I mean, I'd probably just note that in the UK, we have had the assassination of at least two politicians in recent years, namely Joe Cox and David Amess. Um, and yeah, I mean, there is something kind of um, obviously beyond horrific about politicians being targeted for their policies. And also in Holland, probably about 20 years ago, there was the assassination of Pim Fortuyn. Some of these stories are never quite clear on the motive front. So it'll be interesting to find out what exactly is going on with the, by all accounts, near miss on the assassination of Fico. So, moving back to America, former President Trump's campaign recently announced that it has accepted an invitation to debate the current president, Biden, on CNN on June the 27th and on ABC on September the 10th. No guarantee that these debates will take place, of course, and some were surprised at Biden's call. What do we make of this proposal?
I find this disappointing. I was hoping that presidential debates would no longer happen. I was hoping they were fading into irrelevancy. I hate them as a genre, as a pseudo event, as Daniel Borsten called them in the immediate aftermath of the first televised debates, famously between JFK and Nixon. Daniel Borsten's pseudo event uses this or his book The Image uses this as one of the illustrations of the notion of a pseudo event. So yeah, I was hoping that they would simply fade into irrelevance and be forgotten, and that we'd seen various things pointing to this, that they were kind of canceled the previous round. Last year, Trump refused to participate in the Republican primary debates. Instead, pointedly going on Tucker Carlson's show, on Twitter, on X, while the others were engaged in this kind of sham of a debate. So, my opinion is it's an absurd spectacle. complete waste of time and energy, and ideally they will fade into irrelevance and will stop happening at some point. Like, that's one slight reform that seems achievable to me just through sheer inertia in the American political system that I would heartily applaud. But unfortunately, it seems like they may be revived this year, alas. And so we'll be forced to, I will not sit through them, but I will be forced to listen to other people commenting on and talking about them for, days and weeks afterwards. So to me, this is, unambiguously bad news. And I wish it were otherwise.
Matthew, are you looking forward to the double debates? I don't have a view on them. Other than I think they'll be entertaining.
Most notable to me was the language that Biden used in the challenge he issued to Trump on Twitter. He said, go ahead, make my day. A quote from the Don Siegel directed Clint Eastwood film Dirty Harry, where the detective, Dirty Harry, employs the phrase while pointing a revolver at a criminal. Basically, it's the challenge of a figure in authority who's able to wield violence and willing to do so with some freeness to subordinates. And it's interesting just to see Biden invoking this kind of boomer image of the lawless lawman. So, it's part of Biden's broader kind of boomer nostalgia persona. His Omega Speedmaster watch, his Ray-Ban aviators worn by Professor Douglas MacArthur as he swept across the Pacific, and his just all-American sort of preppy way of dressing. Anyway, yeah, we'll have the debates. They'll be taken as tests of stamina and manhood. I don't think that they'll have any meaning beyond that. They won't be about the issues. They will be really a physical test. And the winner will be the one who seems to come through that physical test with the greatest aplomb.
Physical and perhaps mental in some ways. There's obviously been a lot of discussion about the state of mind of actually both men. Increasingly, Trump also in recent months, I've seen chatter about his possible mental decline. Certainly, this is a charge that's been leveled at Biden by many. There is a larger question, which we have discussed previously, about what it means when an empire is being run by octogenarians, whether this is symbolic of a certain decline in vitality. And perhaps we are looking forward to Zoomers taking the reins because Gen X have failed. I apologize once again on behalf of my entire generation for being completely useless. Millennials, well, we'll see. But I think maybe Zoomers will step up and then inject America with new life. Speaking of aged rulers, this week a new portrait of King Charles III was unveiled. In the portrait, the king is surrounded by a pinkish, reddish, textured mist, wearing the uniform of the Welsh Guards, of which he is the colonel, and there's a monarch butterfly over his right shoulder. Denizens of the internet have already suggested there's a hidden Baphomet in mirror images of the painting, much speculation about its potentially satanic and demonic overtones. And anyone who's spent too much time reading conspiracy theories will know that the monarch butterfly has some dark symbolism relating to the mind control of female celebrities in Hollywood and elsewhere. So what do we make of the portrait?
Well, much of the popular response has been absolutely Philistine and just impossibly, uh, insensitive. I think it's a very fine portrait. Some people compared it to Francis Bacon's A Screaming Pope series, these kind of modern takes on Diego Velázquez's famous portrait of Pope Innocent X. I think it probably had, and that comparison was made because there was seen to be something kind of strange or terrifying about it. Uh, I think there's maybe a somewhat closer resemblance to the actual original portrait of Pope Innocent X, which hangs in the Doria Pompili Gallery in Rome, and is absolutely stunning. If you've never seen it, when you're in Rome or when you can get to Rome, go see that one portrait at the gallery. It is absolutely stunning, and there's no replacement for seeing it in person. But the connection between the portrait of Prince Charles and the portrait of Innocent X is just the amount of red around them. Now, for the Bishop of Rome, the color red symbolizes, first of all, the blood of the martyrs, which is also a warrant of the church's authority. For Prince Charles, I don't know what the artist Jonathan Yeo meant by red, but he is wearing a military uniform. He also inhabits his office by virtue of his blood. So the military uniform is associated with bloodletting, of course. That's what it means to be a martial man. And he has his office by virtue of his blood. So I think red is a fitting color. And here I would contrast Yeo's portrait of Prince Charles with his portrait of Tony Blair, which is much less celebrated, but it shows Blair in a suit, not a military uniform, and the color surrounding him, as with Charles, there's basically a monochromatic background, but the color is a blue. And that coolness, that cool color, I think, evokes well the technocratic type of authority or meritocratic type of authority that Blair had as prime minister. It's really a different source of authority than Charles invokes. However real the authority of the British monarchs is today. So I think it's a wonderful portrait. There's more to be said about the butterfly and whatnot, but just on my Twitter timeline, there was this stream of denunciations. Oh, well, this is dark. This is satanic. This is bad. And I thought, oh, please. Well, what do these people want? Do they want everything to be drawn like a children's illustration?
I also am a fan of the new portrait of His Majesty. It reminds me of the work somehow of some of the work of Egon Schiele. Some of my favorite of his paintings are ones in which you have just the sort of the face and the neck to sort and then everything else is sort of overwhelmed by this black background, except for the hands. And of course, in Sheila's case, it's often a kind of starkly black background. Here, it's red, but there's I, I guess I can't articulate why exactly I like that effect in Sheila's paintings, but it means that I also like them in this one. And yeah, I mean that color red is quite striking and attractive to me. So I don't get why people are. I guess I do. I think what they want is what a similar portrait or an analogous portrait might have looked like in the Victorian era or something, and therefore this does not look like that, and therefore it's degenerate or a mistake or a mishap. I don't see it that way. We live in 2024, and there has to be some concession to like trying something new while staying in conversation with other visual sort of forms and elements and so on. And I think this achieves that. So I chalk me up in Matthew's camp on this.
Yeah, I think also maybe a more optimistic reading of the monarch butterfly is King Charles's commitment to the environment and to nature, which is a central feature of his life and his where he puts his time and energy. And he's often been referred to as our perennialist king. He has a deep fascination with traditionalism and some deep green ecology. And I think maybe the butterfly, far from symbolizing some kind of corrupt elite, meaning actually just refers to his love of nature, which is very British also. And he is a very British figure in all of his eccentricity. So with that, I'd like to thank Sohrab, Matthew, Geoff and Stephen, our producer. Don't forget to subscribe at compactmag.com if you haven't already. And thank you for listening.